Hey, welcome to a quick review of some things you'll need to know for your AHP215 A&P class. This is for exam number 1. This is all essay questions. So some of the things that you're going to want to remember. We talked about how the solution will have a change in its pH if we add protons to it. If we add free protons, what we're going to do is we're going to lower the pH number while raising the acidity. So remember that change happens. We talked about the different body cavities, the cranial cavity, thoracic cavity, and the abdominopelvic cavity. And of course, the abdominopelvic cavity is where we're going to find things like the stomach, liver, gallbladder, small intestines, large intestines. The pancreas is way back in there. Even way in the back, you find the 2 kidneys, the urinary bladder, uterus, prostate gland, fallopian tubes, ovaries, things like that. We talked in the cell biology section, we talked about the different organelles, and I mentioned the nucleus, that's the brain of the cell where we find the DNA. I mentioned the ribosomes. Remember, ribosomes are found free-floating in the cytoplasm, and they're also located on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And what the ribosomes do is they act as a sort of a stage. They act as a protein making station. So the components need to be brought to the ribosomes, but then they will build and put together the proteins. We talked about the endoplasmic reticulum. There's the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The smooth is responsible for making lipids. The rough is responsible for making proteins. And I said it's like the protein making factory. So both these are, this is in direct communication with the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum. Talked about the Golgi Apparatus. I refer to it as the packing ship. It puts in the last little bits and pieces that are maybe needed and gets it ready for shipping somewhere within the cell or even towards the outside of the cell. The mitochondria. Mitochondria is the power plant of the cell. The mitochondria is the place where we have ATP being created. It is created on the inner mitochondrial membrane, and it is constantly making ATP, and it has that irregular sort of convoluted inner membrane and a smooth outer membrane. And we even discussed the lysosomes. The lysosomes are those little digestive bags of digestive enzymes that are going to destroy things in the cells. So make sure you keep those in mind. Speaking of cells, we talked about red blood cells. Red blood cell, mature red blood cell is referred to as an erythrocyte. And a mature red blood cell is the thing that transports oxygen throughout the body. There are so many red blood cells in the blood that it makes the blood appear to be red. Remember, I compared these 2 buses where the seats on the bus are made up of the hemoglobin molecule. And the frame is the iron component of the hemoglobin molecule. So, of course, if there's going to be seats on a bus, you're going to have passengers. And the passengers on those red blood cell buses are the oxygen molecules. There's so much hemoglobin, in fact, packed inside a red blood cell, and even on a red blood cell, but packed inside a red blood cell, that it's going to take up too much space for a lot of other things, which is why the red blood cell doesn't have a nucleus. It's also why the red blood cell doesn't have a mitochondria. There just isn't room for it. What that means, of course, is the life expectancy of a red blood cell is about 120 days. Now, I also said, when we were talking about osmosis, and I said, if we take a red blood cell and put it into a solution, we would say the solution is isotonic if there's no net movement of water into or out of the cell. We would say that the solution is hypertonic if we dropped a red blood cell into it, and the water quickly left the red blood cell. Then the red blood cell would shrink, it would crenate. That would be a hypertonic solution. Conversely, if we put a red blood cell into a hypotonic solution, water would rush into the cell, and the cell would expand and then eventually burst, or lyse, L-Y-S-E, lyse. So hypertonic, it crenates, it shrinks. Hypotonic, it swells and then bursts. Let's see. We talked about 4 different types of tissue. Nervous tissue, like you find in the brain and spinal cord. And this is the type of tissue that is going to send signals. It's going to send signals to and from the brain, to and from the spinal cord. It's also going to store information. It's going to interpretate data. It's going to have a memory purpose to it as well. Muscle is another type of tissue, and muscle has a very simple thing that it does. It causes movement, and the way that it causes movement is by contracting, which means the muscle gets shorter. It goes from being its regular size to shorter and then back to its regular size again. In becoming shorter, it's going to pull things towards one another, which is the definition of movement. And of course, we can find skeletal muscle throughout the body. This is the muscle that you think of when you think of somebody having strong muscles. Or we find smooth muscle in areas like the gastrointestinal system and the arteries. They play a huge part in maintaining blood pressure. We see in the reproductive system, you see in the fallopian tubes, for instance, even in the respiratory system. So there's a lot of smooth muscle throughout the body. And then, of course, cardiac muscle, not surprisingly, found in the heart. Then we talked about endothelial tissue, right? Endothelial tissue is tissue that's going to line something. It's going to create a lining, or it's going to create a covering, like the skin, or the lining, the endothelium, which is the lining inside of blood vessels, that's going to allow blood to flow smoothly. And the final one was connective tissue. And connective tissue, not surprisingly, is going to connect things. So examples of connective tissue would be something like cartilage or ligament, tendons, bone, and even blood is considered a connective tissue because it connects everything in the body. What else? We talked about tissue dying. We talked about necrosis and apoptosis. Remember, necrosis is sort of a scheduled cell, apoptosis is a scheduled cell death. This is something that happens and the cells just wear out. It's time for them to die. This is a quiet process. There's no inflammatory process that goes along with this. That's in contrast to necrosis. Necrosis is unscheduled cell death. And anytime there's unscheduled cell death, there's always going to be some form of inflammation. And of course, the thing that follows inflammation is swelling and then redness and pain that goes along with it. In the chemistry section, I said make sure you know some of the abbreviations like iron and calcium and sodium and potassium. Some of the obvious ones that we discussed, chloride. Let's see. In medical terminology, you definitely need to know how to break words down, but you also need to know how to build words up. How you take a word part like a combining form like arthro, and then you add a suffix like itis. Arthro means joint, itis means inflammation of, and you put them together to create the medical term arthritis, inflammation of the joint. And remember that the meaning of a medical word and the definition of a medical word aren't necessarily exactly the same. If you look at the word arthritis, arthro, joint, itis, inflammation of. So to create a definition, we're going to use the suffix first, the definition for the suffix. So the definition of arthritis is inflammation of the joint. It's much more formal. Whereas the meaning of a medical term, arthritis, could just be joint pain. It's somewhat more informal. So when it comes to making an actual definition, it's a much more formal version, and you start with the suffix, then you go back to the beginning of the word and you work your way through. We talked about everything the body does really centered around energy and proteins. 95%, 98%, 99.9% of what we do is we make energy and we make proteins. We make the energy, use the energy, make the energy, use the energy, make the energy, use the energy. And of course, we take in proteins from other areas and we use those proteins to build up other proteins and break them down, make new proteins. So mostly what we're doing is making energy and making proteins. And the three main ingredients of making energy are glucose, oxygen, and water. I know we went into glycolysis and we talked about the breakdown of glucose to pyruvic acid and then how it enters the Krebs cycle, and then the products from that go into the mitochondria and they're going to make the ATP. But at a basic level, the three main ingredients are glucose, oxygen, and water. Those are pretty much what every cell is going to require first. They can use alternatives if they're short of something like glucose, but that's the sort of the first choice for every cell. And then I'm talking about something called bicarbonate, HCO3-. I mentioned this a few times. Bicarbonate, again, HCO3-. This is the most powerful buffer that we have in our blood. It is going to help maintain our blood pH being around 7.4. And that's important because if the pH goes too low, if it becomes too acidic, then it can start to damage cells, especially the very delicate neurons that we find in the brain, for instance. So the bicarbonate is something that we create when we create carbon dioxide. Most carbon dioxide that our cells make, we're going to exhale, but some of that carbon dioxide is going to stay in the blood. So carbon dioxide travels in the blood as bicarbonate and then reforms back into carbon dioxide and water, basically, at the lungs where we can exhale the excess. But we always want to maintain that balance of bicarbonate. It is the single most powerful buffer we have in the blood. So I would suggest that you seriously review the medical terminology. Make sure you know the combining forms, the suffixes, the prefixes. Make sure you know how to build words, put them together, and go through some of the things I just discussed. Find them in the notes and make sure you know those. Anyway, good luck, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.